The dust settled like a shroud over the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge as the sun began its descent behind the rocky peaks that surrounded the valley. The main street, little more than a dirt path flanked by weathered wooden buildings, buzzed with the usual evening activity of cowboys finishing their day's work and merchants closing their shops. But in the shadows of the general store's porch, a scene unfolded that would forever change the lives of three souls who had never met before this fateful evening. 8-year-old Mary Catherine sat beside her father, her small hands cupped together as she whispered the same plea she had uttered countless times that day. "Please, mister, just a penny for some bread." Her voice carried the weight of desperation that no child should ever know, yet there was something in her bright blue eyes that refused to surrender to despair. Her father, Thomas, sat slumped against the wooden post, his weathered face bearing the lines of a man who had seen too much hardship in his 63 years of life. The calluses on his hands told the story of decades of honest work, but now those same hands trembled with weakness from hunger and exhaustion. Thomas had been a proud man once, a skilled carpenter who had built half the houses in the neighboring county before deciding to try his hand at homesteading. He had worked his own plot of land just outside of town, dreaming of creating something lasting for his family. But the brutal drought of the previous summer had claimed his crops, leaving the fields barren and cracked under the merciless sun. The harsh winter that followed had brought more than just bitter cold. It had taken his beloved wife, Mary Catherine's mother, to consumption. With no money for proper medicine and no harvest to sell, Thomas had watched helplessly as the woman he loved faded away, leaving him alone with a small daughter and mounting debts he could never hope to repay. The bank had foreclosed on his land 3 months ago, and now he and his daughter were reduced to begging on the streets of a town that had once respected him as a hard-working neighbor. Every day, he watched Mary Catherine grow thinner and more fragile, her childhood innocence slowly being worn away by the harsh realities of their situation. The shame of their circumstances ate at him like acid, but his love for his daughter was stronger than his pride. He would endure any humiliation if it meant keeping her alive. "Papa, I'm so hungry," Mary Catherine whispered, her stomach growling audibly in the gathering dusk. The sound cut through Thomas like a knife, and he felt his heart break anew as he pulled his daughter closer to his side. He had given her the last of their meager food that morning, a piece of stale bread he had saved from their previous day's begging. His own stomach had been empty for 2 days now, but he would rather die than let his little girl go without sustenance. "I know, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "Maybe tomorrow will be better. Maybe someone will have work for your old papa." But even as he spoke the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. Who would hire a broken, down old man when strong young cowboys were plentiful in these parts? And who would want a worker who came with the burden of a small child who needed constant care and attention? The afternoon had been particularly difficult. They had approached nearly every business in town, asking for work, for food, for any kind of assistance. Some people had ignored them completely, hurrying past with averted eyes. Others had offered harsh words, telling them to move along and find somewhere else to be a burden. A few kind souls had dropped coins into Mary Catherine's outstretched hands, but it was never enough to buy a proper meal, just scraps that barely kept them alive from one day to the next. As the evening shadows lengthened and the temperature began to drop, most of the townspeople had retreated to their warm homes and hearty dinners, leaving the streets nearly empty. Thomas was about to suggest they find shelter in the alley behind the church, where the pastor sometimes allowed them to sleep, when the sound of spurs jingling against wooden planks caught his attention. A tall figure emerged from the saloon across the street, and even in the dim light, Thomas could see this was no ordinary drifter passing through town. Jack Morrison stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work under the unforgiving sun. His weathered leather chaps and worn hat marked him as a man who had spent his life on horseback, working cattle across the endless prairies. His clothes were practical and sturdy, showing the wear of constant use, but also the care of someone who respected his possessions. But it was his eyes that set him apart from the typical cowboy who passed through Cedar Ridge. They held a depth of understanding that came from someone who had known both triumph and tragedy, joy and sorrow, and had somehow managed to retain his humanity through it all. Jack had been riding the range for nearly 20 years, ever since he was barely older than Mary Catherine was now. His own childhood had been marked by hardship. Orphaned at 12, he had learned to survive on his own in a world that showed little mercy to the weak or vulnerable. He had worked for various ranchers, saved every penny he could, and eventually bought his own small spread about 50 miles north of town. It wasn't much by some standards, just a few hundred acres with a modest house and a barn, but it was his. He had built it with his own hands, shaped it with his own sweat and determination. More importantly, it was lonely. Jack had never married, had no children of his own, and as he had grown older, the silence of his empty house had become almost unbearable. He would sit at his kitchen table in the evenings, eating meals meant for one, and wonder what it would be like to have someone to talk to share his thoughts and dreams with. The cattle were good company during the day, but they couldn't fill the emptiness that seemed to grow larger with each passing year. He had come to Cedar Ridge to sell some cattle and pick up supplies, planning to ride back to his ranch in the morning. The business had gone well. He had gotten a fair price for his livestock and had enough money to last him through the winter. But as he stepped out of the saloon after sharing a drink with some other ranchers, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the soft sound of a child's voice, or maybe it was the way the evening light caught the golden hair of the little girl sitting beside the old man. Whatever it was, Jack found himself drawn across the street toward the unlikely pair. As he approached, he could see more clearly the toll that hunger and desperation had taken on both of them. The little girl's dress, though clean and carefully mended, hung loose on her thin frame. Her father's clothes were worn but respectable, the attire of a man who had once known better days. There was something about their quiet dignity in the face of such obvious hardship that touched something deep in Jack's chest. "Evening," Jack said quietly, tipping his hat as he approached. His voice was gentle, careful not to startle them. Up close, he could see the hollow cheeks and tired eyes that marked them as people who had been hungry for far too long. The little girl looked up at him with those startling blue eyes, and Jack felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, a protective instinct, a desire to help that went beyond mere charity. "Evening, sir," Thomas replied, struggling to straighten up despite his weakness. Even in his reduced circumstances, he maintained the dignity that had once made him a respected member of the community. "Don't mind us, we'll be moving along shortly. We don't want to cause any trouble." But Jack didn't move away. Instead, he knelt down so he was at eye level with Mary Catherine, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "What's your name, little one?" "Mary Catherine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mary Catherine Brennan. There was something about this stranger's kind eyes that made her feel safe, safer than she had felt in months. "That's a beautiful name," Jack said with a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'm Jack Morrison, and I was wondering if you and your papa might be hungry. I was just thinking about getting some supper myself, and I sure would appreciate the company." Thomas's pride warred with his desperation as he looked at this stranger who was showing them more kindness than they had received in weeks. He wanted to refuse to maintain what little dignity he had left, but one look at his daughter's hopeful face made the decision for him. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison, but we couldn't possibly impose. We have no way to repay such generosity, no imposition at all," Jack said, standing and extending his hand to help Thomas to his feet. "Truth is, I eat alone most nights, and it gets mighty lonesome. You'd be doing me the favor." He gently took Mary Catherine's small hand in his large, calloused one. "Come on, little lady. Let's get you some food." The three of them made their way to the small restaurant next to the hotel, where Jack ordered enough food for a small army. He watched with a mixture of satisfaction and heartbreak as Mary Catherine ate with the desperate hunger of someone who wasn't sure when her next meal would come. She tried to maintain her manners, but her small hands shook as she brought the food to her mouth, and tears of relief rolled down her cheeks as she tasted the first substantial meal she had eaten in days. Thomas ate more slowly, his manners still impeccable despite his circumstances, but Jack could see the profound gratitude in the older man's eyes. Between bites, Thomas began to tell his story without self-pity or complaint. He spoke of the drought that had turned his fields to dust, of the crops that had withered and died despite his best efforts. He told of his wife's final illness, of sitting by her bedside and watching her waste away while he felt helpless to save her. He described the gradual loss of everything he had worked for throughout his life, the foreclosure, the desperate search for work that had brought them to this point. I keep thinking I'll find something, Thomas said, his voice growing heavy with exhaustion. I'm not a lazy man, Mr. Morrison. I've worked hard my whole life. But I'm not as young as I once was, and Mary Catherine needs looking after. Most folks don't want to hire a man with a child in tow, especially when there are plenty of young, unattached cowboys looking for work. Jack nodded thoughtfully, his mind already working through possibilities. There was something about this man's quiet dignity, his obvious love for his daughter, and his skilled hands that stirred something in Jack's practical mind. What kind of work did you do before you took up farming? I was a carpenter by trade, Thomas replied with a hint of his old pride. Built most of the houses in the county east of here before I decided to try my hand at homesteading. Seemed like farming would be a steadier life, more secure for a family. He shook his head ruefully. Shows how much I knew about the ways of the world. A carpenter. Jack mused, his eyes brightening with interest. That's mighty interesting. I've got a ranch about 50 miles north of here, and I've been needing to make some repairs to my barn and maybe add on to the house. Been putting it off because I don't know much about building, and the nearest town with a proper carpenter is 100 miles away. Thomas looked up sharply, hope flickering in his tired eyes like a candle flame in the wind. You're serious about this? Dead serious, Jack replied firmly. I've got a bunkhouse that's been empty for 2 years since my last hired hand moved on to start his own spread. It's not fancy, but it's clean and dry, and it's got a good roof and a warm stove. You and Mary Catherine would be welcome to stay there while you work on my buildings. I'd pay fair wages, and you'd have all the food you could eat. Mary Catherine looked between the two men, her young mind trying to process what was being discussed. The very idea of having a warm, dry place to sleep and regular meals seemed almost too good to be true. Papa, does that mean we'd have a place to sleep? A real bed with blankets? Thomas felt tears prick his eyes as he looked at his daughter, seeing hope replace the resignation that had been growing in her young face. It might, sweetheart, if Mr. Morrison is truly serious about this generous offer. I wouldn't make the offer if I wasn't serious, Jack said firmly. I've got plenty of work that needs doing, and I could use the company. Gets pretty quiet out there with just me and the cattle for conversation. He paused, studying both their faces carefully. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't charity. You'd be earning your keep, Thomas. I need the work done, and I need it done right. From what I can see, you're the kind of man who takes pride in his craftsmanship. You won't find a harder worker or a more honest man, Thomas said, his voice strengthening with each word. I may be down on my luck, but I'm not down on my character. You give me a chance, and I'll give you work you can be proud of. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Jack helped Thomas and Mary Catherine load their few possessions into his wagon. Thomas had insisted on gathering the tools he had managed to keep hidden during the worst of their troubles, and Jack was impressed by the quality of the carpenter's equipment. These were the tools of a craftsman, well maintained and carefully chosen. It told Jack more about Thomas's character than any words could have. The journey to Jack's ranch took most of the day, with Mary Catherine sitting between the two men on the wagon seat, her eyes wide with wonder at the vast landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. She had never been this far from Cedar Ridge, and everything seemed like an adventure after the desperation of their recent circumstances. The prairie rolled away like an ocean of grass, dotted with wildflowers and crossed by clear streams that sparkled in the sunlight. Are there really cattle out here? She asked, peering into the distance where the prairie seemed to meet the sky in a shimmering line. Hundreds of them. Jack replied with a smile, pleased by her curiosity and enthusiasm. And horses, too. Do you like horses, Mary Catherine? I don't know, she admitted honestly. I've never been close to one. Are they scary? Not if you treat them right, Jack said. I've got a gentle old mare named Buttercup who loves children. She's too old for ranch work now, but she's perfect for learning to ride. Would you like that? Mary Catherine's eyes lit up with excitement. Could I really learn to ride a horse? I don't see why not, Jack said. Every person who lives on a ranch should know how to ride. It's as important as knowing how to walk. As they approached Jack's ranch in the late afternoon, Thomas felt a surge of emotion he hadn't experienced in months. The house was modest but well built, with a wraparound porch and windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The barn was large and sturdy, though he could see with his carpenter's eye areas where repairs were needed. Beyond the buildings, Cattle grazed peacefully in fenced pastures that stretched to the horizon, and the sight of such prosperity and order filled him with hope. "It's beautiful," Mary Catherine breathed, and Jack felt his heart swell with pride at her words. The bunkhouse was exactly as Jack had described it, simple but clean, with 2 beds covered in warm quilts, a small table and chairs, and a wood stove for heating. Thomas had expected something much more primitive, but this was better than some of the places they had been forced to sleep during their months of wandering. There were even curtains on the windows and a small mirror on the wall. "I'll let you get settled in," Jack said, setting their few belongings on the table. "There's a pump outside for water, and I've got plenty of firewood stacked against the back wall. Tomorrow we can start looking at what needs to be done around here, but tonight, you just rest." That night, as Mary Catherine slept peacefully in a real bed for the first time in months, Thomas sat by the window looking out at the star-filled sky. The silence was different here than it had been in town, not the silence of loneliness and desperation, but the peaceful quiet of a place where people could sleep safely and wake up to new possibilities. He had almost given up hope that their situation would ever improve, but now he dared to believe that perhaps they had found not just work, but a new beginning. Over the following weeks, Thomas threw himself into his work with an energy that surprised even himself. The barn repairs were more extensive than Jack had initially thought, but Thomas tackled each problem with the skill and attention to detail that had once made him sought after throughout the county. He rebuilt rotting support beams, replaced damaged siding, and reinforced the foundation with the precision of a master craftsman. Jack found himself genuinely impressed by the older man's expertise and work ethic. Meanwhile, Mary Catherine was discovering a world she had never imagined. Jack had been true to his word about Buttercup, and the gentle mare had become her constant companion. Under Jack's patient instruction, she learned to ride, to help with simple ranch chores, and to appreciate the rhythms of life on the frontier. She gathered eggs from the chickens, helped milk the cows, and learned to identify different types of plants and animals. "She's like a different child," Thomas observed one evening as they watched Mary Catherine playing with a litter of barn kittens. "I was beginning to worry that all the hardship had taken something from her that she'd never get back." Jack nodded, but he was thinking about more than just Mary Catherine's transformation. Having people to share his meals with, to talk to at the end of the day, to worry about and care for, had awakened something in him that he hadn't realized was missing. The loneliness that had plagued him for years had disappeared, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that he had never experienced before. As autumn approached, Thomas completed the barn repairs and began work on the addition to the house that Jack had mentioned. But there was something different about this project. Jack had originally talked about adding a simple room for storage, but as they discussed the plans, it had evolved into something much more substantial. A proper bedroom for Mary Catherine, and improvements to the main house that would make it more suitable for a family. "Jack," Thomas said one evening as they reviewed the plans spread out on the kitchen table, "I have to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. What exactly are you planning here? This isn't just temporary help anymore, is it?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring at the drawings and measurements that covered the table. "I suppose I'm planning to ask you and Mary Catherine to stay permanently. Not just as hired help, but as family. I've been thinking about it for weeks now, and I can't imagine this place without you both." Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. "Jack, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't ask you to take on that kind of responsibility. You've already done more for us than anyone had a right to expect." "You're not asking," Jack replied firmly. "I'm offering. Thomas, I've been alone for most of my adult life, and I thought that was what I wanted. But having you and Mary Catherine here has shown me what I've been missing. This place feels like a home for the first time since I built it. And if Mary Catherine grows up and wants to leave, if she wants to see the world beyond this ranch, then we'll help her do that," Jack said without hesitation. "But until then, I'd like to give her the childhood she deserves, and I'd like to give you the chance to watch her grow up without having to worry about where your next meal is coming from." Thomas looked out the window to where Mary Catherine was brushing Buttercup in the coral, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "She's already started calling you Uncle Jack," he said quietly. "I noticed that," Jack replied with a smile. "I like the sound of it more than I can say." That night, Thomas made his decision. He had swallowed his pride once to accept Jack's help when they were desperate, and now he would set aside his pride again to accept something even more precious, a chance for his daughter to have a real home and a future filled with possibilities. The addition to the house was completed just before the first snow of winter, and Mary Catherine moved into her new bedroom with a joy that was infectious. Jack had insisted on buying her new clothes, books, and even a beautiful doll from the general store in Cedar Ridge, but it was clear that what she treasured most was the sense of security and belonging that came from having a real home. As winter settled over the ranch, the three of them developed routines and traditions that bound them together as surely as blood. Jack taught Mary Catherine to read from the collection of books he had accumulated over the years, while Thomas shared stories of his own childhood and the mother she barely remembered. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Jack carving small wooden animals for Mary Catherine while Thomas worked on furniture projects that would make their home more comfortable. One particularly cold evening in February, as the wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, Mary Catherine looked up from the wooden horse Jack had just finished carving for her. "Uncle Jack, are we going to stay here forever?" Jack glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "Would you like to stay here forever, sweetheart?" "Oh yes," she said without hesitation. "This is the best home I've ever had, and you're the best uncle, and Papa's the happiest I've ever seen him." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes as he realized the truth of his daughter's words. He was happier than he had been in years, not just because their immediate needs were met, but because he had found something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of purpose and belonging. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Jack began teaching Mary Catherine more advanced writing skills, and Thomas started a garden behind the house where Mary Catherine could help grow vegetables for their table. The ranch work continued, but it felt different now. Instead of one man struggling to manage everything alone, it was a family working together toward common goals. One afternoon in late spring, as Thomas was teaching Mary Catherine to identify different types of wood and explaining their various uses, Jack approached them with a serious expression on his face. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "and I wanted to discuss it with both of you." Mary Catherine looked up from the piece of oak she had been examining. "What is it, Uncle Jack?" "Well, I've been thinking that maybe it's time to make our arrangement official. Legal, I mean." He looked at Thomas with eyes that were both hopeful and nervous. "I'd like to adopt Mary Catherine, if you're willing. And I'd like to change the deed to this ranch so that it belongs to all three of us." Thomas felt his world tilt on its axis. "Jack, that's an incredible offer. But are you sure? Adoption is permanent. There's no going back from something like that?" "I don't want to go back," Jack said firmly. "Mary Catherine is already my daughter in every way that matters. I love her like she was my own blood, and I want to make sure she always has a home and a future, no matter what happens to me." Mary Catherine looked between the two men, her young mind trying to process what was being discussed. "Does that mean Uncle Jack would really be my papa too?" "It means you'd have two papas who love you very much," Thomas said gently. "And it means this ranch would always be your home no matter what." The legal proceedings took several weeks, requiring trips to the county seat and meetings with lawyers and judges. But on a warm day in June, exactly 1 year after Jack had first found them begging on the streets of Cedar Ridge, Mary Catherine Brennan Morrison stood in a courtroom and officially became the daughter of two men who had learned that family wasn't just about blood, but about love and commitment and choosing to stand by each other through whatever life might bring. The judge, a kindly man who had seen many difficult cases pass through his courtroom, smiled as he finalized the paperwork. "Mr. Morrison, Mr. Brennan, you have a very lucky little girl, and Mary Catherine, you have two very lucky fathers." As they left the courthouse, Mary Catherine skipped between her two fathers, holding both their hands. "Can we go home now?" she asked. "I want to show Buttercup my new papers." Thomas and Jack exchanged a look over her head, both thinking the same thing: home. It was a word that had taken on new meaning for all of them. Not just a place, but a feeling of belonging and security that came from choosing to love and be loved in return. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were harsh winters when the cattle needed extra care and the work was backbreaking. There were dry summers when the pastures struggled and water had to be carefully conserved. There were the usual trials that came with raising a spirited young girl on the frontier, including scraped knees, teenage rebellions, and the delicate negotiations of preparing a young woman for adulthood. But through it all, they faced each obstacle together, their bond growing stronger with each passing season. Mary Catherine grew from a frightened, hungry child into a confident young woman who could ride as well as any cowboy, help with the ranch work, and still maintain the gentle grace her mother had passed down to her. She never forgot the lessons of her early years, the knowledge of what it meant to be truly desperate, and that awareness made her compassionate toward others who faced hard times. Thomas aged gracefully, his skills as a carpenter making him valuable not just on their ranch but throughout the county. He built furniture and repaired buildings for neighbors, always fair in his prices and generous with his time. The broken man who'd once begged on the streets of Cedar Ridge had transformed into a respected member of the community, his dignity restored not through charity, but through the opportunity to use his skills and contribute to something meaningful. Jack found that his ranch prospered as never before, not just because of the extra hands to help with the work, but because he had something to work for beyond his own survival. Providing for Mary Catherine and Thomas gave his life a purpose that cattle and solitude never could. He became known throughout the region as a fair employer and a generous neighbor, always ready to help other families who faced the kinds of hardships that had once brought Thomas and Mary Catherine to his attention. On Mary Catherine's 18th birthday, the three of them sat on the porch of the house Thomas had helped expand and improve, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Mary Catherine had received several letters from schools in the East, offers for education that her two fathers had encouraged her to consider seriously. "I've been thinking about those letters from the schools," Mary Catherine said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them. "And I've made my decision about what I want to do." Both men tensed slightly, knowing that this moment had been coming but not quite ready for it. "I want to go," she continued, "but not permanently. I want to learn everything I can about business and maybe even law so I can come back and help other families like we used to be. There are too many people out there who need help, and I think I can make a difference." Thomas felt his heart swell with pride, even as it broke a little at the thought of her leaving. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become," he said softly. Jack nodded, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "We'll miss you something terrible, but we'll be here when you come back. This will always be your home, no matter how far you travel or how long you're gone." Mary Catherine looked at the two men who had saved her life and given her a future she never could have imagined. "You know, I used to think that day when Uncle Jack found us begging was the worst day of my life. But now I realize it was the best day of my life, because it brought us together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had started as strangers brought together by desperation and compassion, but they had become something much more precious, a family bound not by blood but by choice, by love, and by the unshakable belief that everyone deserved a chance at hope, dignity, and belonging. Years later, when Mary Catherine returned from her studies in the East, she brought with her not just knowledge, but a vision that would change countless lives. She established a program that connected struggling families with ranchers who needed skilled workers, creating a network of support that spread across the territory. The program became known as the Morrison Foundation, named after the man who had shown her that one person's compassion could change everything. The foundation grew beyond anyone's wildest dreams, helping hundreds of families find not just work but hope and dignity. Mary Catherine married a good man, a doctor who shared her passion for helping others, and together they raised children of their own on the ranch that had become their sanctuary. She made sure her own children understood the story of their grandfather's kindness and the importance of helping those in need. Thomas lived to see his daughter's children grow and prosper, to watch the ranch become a symbol of hope for struggling families throughout the region. He passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the family he had helped create through his resilience and dignity. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his kindness and craftsmanship. Jack continued to run the ranch well into his 70s, but he was never alone again. The house that had once echoed with silence now rang with the laughter of grandchildren, the conversations of friends, and the satisfaction of a life well lived. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in cattle or land, but in the love and loyalty of the people who chose to stand by you through good times and bad. On his deathbed, surrounded by the family he had chosen and who had chosen him in return, Jack called Mary Catherine to his side. "Do you remember that first night?" he whispered. "When I found you and your father on the street." "Every detail," she replied, tears streaming down her face as she held his weathered hand. "I thought I was saving you," he said with a weak smile. "But you saved me. You both did. You taught me what it meant to be truly alive, to have something worth living for." The ranch continued to thrive under Mary Catherine's guidance, but it had become something more than just a cattle operation. It was a symbol of hope, a place where people came to remember that no matter how dark their circumstances might seem, there was always the possibility of redemption, of new beginnings, and of finding family in the most unexpected places. Every year on the anniversary of that first meeting, the community would gather at the ranch for a celebration that honored not just the Morrison family, but the idea that compassion could triumph over hardship, that kindness was never wasted, and that sometimes the most profound changes in life came not from grand gestures, but from the simple decision to see another person's need and respond with an open heart. The story of the little girl who begged for food with her elderly father, and the stranger who gave them not just a meal but a home, became a legend that parents told their children and preachers shared from their pulpits. It reminded everyone who heard it that in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, there was still room for miracles, and that those miracles most often came wrapped in the ordinary clothing of human kindness and the extraordinary power of choosing to love. As the sun set over the Morrison Ranch each evening, casting long shadows across the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, visitors could still feel the presence of the three souls who had found each other in their darkest hour and created something beautiful together. Their legacy lived on in every family that was helped, every stranger who was welcomed, and every act of compassion that rippled outward from that dusty street in Cedar Ridge, where a desperate father and daughter had received far more than they had ever dared to hope for. The frontier had tested them all with its harsh realities and unforgiving nature, but it had also provided the backdrop for a story of transformation that proved the most powerful force in the wilderness was not the strength of a man's gun or the quickness of his draw, but the simple willingness to see another person's humanity and respond with an open heart. It was a lesson that would echo through the generations, a reminder that in a world that could be brutal and unforgiving, there was still room for kindness, hope, and the miraculous transformation that could occur when strangers chose to become family. In the end, that chance encounter on the dusty street of Cedar Ridge had changed 3 lives forever, but its impact reached far beyond those 3 souls. It became a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of second chances, and the truth that sometimes the most profound changes in life come not from what we achieve, but from what we choose to give to others. The story of Thomas and Mary Catherine Brennan and Jack Morrison would be remembered long after the frontier had given way to civilization, serving as a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt lost, forgotten, or alone in the world, proving that sometimes salvation comes not in the form we expect, but in the simple kindness of a stranger who chooses to see our humanity and respond with love.